I'm your host, Tyler Sanders. I'm here with Dr. Greg Watson and Dr. Paul Kelly. Today, we're talking about how to teach for the heart. And there's a couple elements to that. So there's some questions we're going to answer here about how to read and understand and find emotion in the biblical text, and then how to effectively communicate that. Can you get us a little further, Dr. Kelly?
Well, I just think that there's a little bit of a tendency, in a lot of our Bible study classes to sit down and really try to get to the bottom line truth. And I'm a truth guy, so I like that. But the problem is that so much of Scripture speaks with such vivid language and such part of the reason why I think so much theology in Scripture is written in the form of narrative, in the form of stories, is because there's emotional content that's conveyed in that there's a life that I'm watching, a life that I can identify with. And our tendency is to a little bit go in and sort of bleach all that of the emotion and just get to what's the point? What's it trying to say? And there's a tendency for us sometimes to delete, almost to delete emotion, move it out of the way so that we can get to the truth. And we focus so much on what I'm supposed to understand and what I'm supposed to do. Sometimes we miss what I'm supposed to feel. Mm-hmm. And I kind of think that that's an important aspect. I mean, God didn't create us as automatons that have no emotional,
right. It's part of the human experience.
Absolutely, yeah. It is. And so, trying to help people to engage with their faith, not exclusively on an emotional level, but certainly not to the neglect of the emotion that's in the text or the emotions that they experience in life. I think those things are kind of important as I teach a Bible study class.
Yeah, right.
And this isn't to say that emotion should replace our pursuit of truth and factualness.
Right.
I think a lot of modern thought and just in practice, people assign things as true based on how they feel about them, how they feel about themselves. I identify this way, and because I identify or I feel a certain way, therefore that's true. They even use this thing of, it's my truth.
Sure.
And as believers, we believe that all truth resides in, with, and through God.
Yeah.
So we can't allow emotion to do that. And our tendency, I think, is to just try and banish emotion, is to kind of push it off to the side and just focus on the facts, ma'am, to quote Joe Friday. That dates me.
I'm thinking there may not be anybody listening to this podcast that can think back
Joe
to, what?
They'll be Googling Joe Friday, right? But we must recognize that the text does convey truth.
Yeah.
And that the best way for that truth to get planted in our lives and in the way we choose to live our lives is to have an emotional sense and to have the emotion of the moment attached to it. So as we communicate, we not only communicate the truth of the passage, we also communicate it that there's emotional content there.
Right.
We'll talk about Isaiah 6 in here in a second. But it's not only that. It's the teacher communicating the emotion that they understand comes through the passage to the students.
Yeah,
right.
It's almost like
by the way, listen to this guy. Listen to Paul talk, and you'll hear exactly what I mean.
Well, I was just going to say it's almost like, we have to, as teachers, we've got to start by feeling the text as well as knowing it, if we're going to help other folks to be able to do that as well.
Right.
And if I'm not paying attention to the emotional language, or even in some cases, just the emotional experiences, the humanness of the experiences that people are having, then it's going to be hard for me to ever be able to give my class something that's rich. I was, one of the things I was thinking about is one of our colleagues that used to work with us some time ago did his doctoral work focused on emotional intelligence, and one of the things that he found is that there's an awful lot of us who know biblical truth, But what he said is that sometimes when you get to the idea of emotional intelligence, that is being able to understand and communicate with emotion, to be able to deal with other people's emotions, to be able to express your emotions without them, interfering with, with other things, that there's this emotional intelligence that we develop. And maybe this doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about, but it just struck me that it seems like that there is this sense of when we live out the text, that doing that with a full emotional intelligence, with an intelligence of this cost me something, or this is an ecstatic kind of an experience, or something like that, that seems like that it could be a really rich part of Bible study.
Yeah.
We can draw people's attention to the passion that is in the text. I use passion for emotion. It's a good word. To the passion that's in the text. And I think that's huge, because we need to connect the passion and the truth that is there. But it's interesting when I think about the passion with which I present stuff. Number one, anybody's going to be attracted to the passion. Some people are going to be very, very suspicious of it.
Yeah.
Because but here's the thing with that. That's fine, because it means they either what you're saying is true because you believe so much, or it's false and you just really believe the lie. And I would rather because if we don't have that passion, people get bored with what we're saying very quick. It's the emotion, I think, adds some credibility. The emotion of our presentation adds credibility, and it draws people to what we're saying.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, it seems like maybe there's like a couple categories here, because sometimes when you're reading the Bible, it's obvious there's a big emotional element. Sometimes it's a little bit less obvious. Sometimes there's like the language is really saying like how people are feeling, or they're, I mean, I know I always go back to Jonah, but I always think of like, he's like so angry, he's ready to die. Like that's really giving you a very explicit emotional experience of, of what Jonah's going through. Sometimes it's a little bit less explicit, and maybe just the story is kind of telling you things, and you may need to carefully kind of assess how a person may be feeling. How do you kind of walk between these kind of categories? How much is too much reading into the text? How much is like, exactly what you're pulling out?
Boy, what a great segue. We were talking about several instances that one of them was Isaiah 6. And this is a poetic passage. It's largely poetic. And listen, one of the things that poetry does is it evokes, it draws on our ability to respond emotionally to things.
Yeah.
It uses imagery. It uses things that emote, that trigger our emotive responses.
It's a lot of sensory information. It's telling you a lot about, it's a lot of visual, and it's a lot of how things feel. It's a lot.
Right. And I think rightly so, our tendency is to drive into the descriptions that we read there, and almost, like good and rational people, we kind of want to separate it from the emotion so that we understand it in its own terms. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But listen to Isaiah 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, historical fact number one.
Yeah.
Right.
King Uzziah had been king for about 45 years. Extremely successful, extremely rule, and all of a sudden this king is dead. Stability is, so you can see that that's an important statement. And we can look at the historical circumstances that describe that.
Yeah. Well, and it's cool the way that you say that too, because it's like it is a historical fact. It gives us a timestamp. But if this is really this time of transition, this time of instability, this time where Uzziah has been this king that's led, and all of a sudden we have this upset in things, the apple cart's being turned over. It's like the president of a seminary is transitioning out or something like
exactly.
I mean, it's like everybody is talking about what happens when the next king comes in, what changes. So there is this sort of emotional ripple that follows through even that statement.
Right. And so then it immediately goes into a description, and I'll talk about it in a second, but this is clearly a vision. Okay, this is, we don't know if he was asleep. We don't know if he's meditating. The Lord sends this, but this is clearly a vision. He says, I saw the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and his robe filled the temple, filled the whole temple. Seraphim were standing above him, each one had 6 wings, and so on and so on. Now, if you stop and think back a minute about the structure of the tabernacle and the Holy of Holies and the temple, which is modeled on it, what you have here is Isaiah sees in this vision, he is standing in the Holy of Holies before the Ark of the Covenant. The seraphim, if you look in the descriptions on the curtains, seraphim were painted in this highly artistic way on the curtains that hung over the over the Ark of the Covenant. And where was it that the Lord dwelt? He dwelt between angels. And so what he sees here is all of a sudden it animates, you know, and this vision of this thing that he, you know, this picture he had is all of a sudden it comes to life. And the intention of that is to drive up the emotional impact of encountering. Listen to this. I saw the Lord seated high on a throne, on a lofty throne. The King James is beautiful. I saw the Lord, and behold, he was high and lifted up. That is evokes. It ought to evoke an awe of this God that's there.
Yeah.
Right. And then the word, the thrice holy, 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 holy is the Lord of hosts. One holy is pretty holy.
Yeah.
Two holies is pretty doggone holy, but holy, holy, holy. It ain't no holier than this.
Yeah.
So there, you know, and if we simply go holy, 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 you know, we're not really Bueller.
Yeah.
We're really just boring people. Man, use the animation of your life and your experience to kind of draw people into the emotion of these circumstances.
Yeah. Well, I think that's so good because all of the things that you could describe, you could just sort of set aside and say, okay, this is what it was, and this is what it looked like, and this is what the seraphim were, and this is what, you know, and you can go through and just sort of bust all that down into principal kinds of things. This means this, and this means that. And you can do all that and miss the sense of awe, the sense of just being enraptured, the sense of this being such an expansive picture. I mean, even the description of the seraphim, you know, is crazy to me, not because it sort of lifts up the seraphim, but because it's like these creatures that are so unbelievably majestic, magnificent, beyond compare, are just there to celebrate the holy God. You know?
You're getting excited, man.
But I think that when you start reading the text, you know, because you were saying, let's start by talking about just how we read the text in terms of emotion, that seeing these pictures, seeing this language is supposed to do more to us than give us this is what God's like moment. It's supposed to give us this overwhelming gush of what it's like to stand in the very presence of God.
Yeah. And I think I don't know that I really I don't even know if I thought about it like that quite yet as I kind of brought this topic up, but like there's an element of reading what the people in the text are experiencing emotionally, but also how the reader is supposed to experience it. There's a whole step there, you know?
Yeah.
Look, you know, the reader response people, they you know, that's a particular way of approaching the text where the meaning resides only with me.
Right.
I reject that.
Of course.
Totally one-sided.
Yeah, of course.
But the truth is every reader is impacted in some way by what they read.
Yeah.
And the better we teach them how it ought to be read, and here's a good example of why this is important. We tend to think about and talk about God in terms of our theological understandings, our propositions, right? God is love. God is holy. God is just. God is sovereign. God is omnipotent, omnipresent, all these different things. But God is not a proposition. And he is far more than the summary of all the things that we say and believe about God.
Yeah. And even beyond that, our faith is not about the propositions we believe, but it's about a relationship with the creator of the universe, with a relationship with the one who died and provided salvation for us. That it's the reconciliation in all that relational capacity, which I think has an emotional kind of component to it, you know, it's more, that's what our faith is, not just those propositions we believe, even though our understanding and our knowledge and our experience with God is going to be largely fit within the framework of this is who we know that God is.
Yeah.
My belief, my adherence to, my promise to affirm the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 makes me a Southern Baptist, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't make me a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
These are the foundations on which I walk and that give me the planks I walk on in my faith.
Yeah.
But it's the core truth of any Christian anywhere, any denomination. It's that core truth, who Jesus Christ was, what he did on the cross and in his resurrection.
Yeah.
That is the core truth. And then I want to tie very closely his return.
Yeah.
Of course, right.
But those first two are the core issues about being a Christian.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Which is not to in any way denigrate doctrine or theology. We don't mean to do that at all. It's just to say that, that there's more of us than just our heads that get wrapped up in this faith experience.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's probably true. I want to be careful how I say this so that I'm not kind of trying to advocate for a purely experiential version of faith. But I think that's probably true for most people, is that they do have very deep emotional experiences as they're going through their life with faith. I mean, like that's a very common experience.
Well, and we've got to be careful that we don't. There are different levels of encountering the text.
Yeah.
At a very basic level, we as believers, we read the text and we have an encounter with the word that it's individual, it's existential. I don't know. It's very personal. It's kind of transcends any moment. But that doesn't give me the authority to go and take my experience and what I draw from that in my personal life. I can't go force you guys to do it.
Yeah.
There's another level that we're talking about at teaching, and even that has its own levels in it. But there's another level is which I'm not responsible to teach my own personal thing on this. My job is to teach the text.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to much of what we've been saying in this podcast is that it's so important that we make the text come alive. That what I think is tertiary to all of this, that what's important is that I help people to understand what the Bible says. I'm just suggesting, in educational theory, we talk about 3 domains of learning, that we learn things in terms of our understanding. We call that the cognitive domain, that we learn by understanding things. And we spend a lot of time with that in Sunday school classes and in Bible studies,
and in seminary.
And in seminary, and it's highly important, and any of the Bible study curriculum that I've developed or anything like that, we've spent a lot of time trying to help people to develop a sense of understanding of the text. There's also the domain, we call it the psychomotor domain, the domain of developing skills. And actually, it's not just, to understand how to evangelize is sort of different than developing the skill of evangelism. That if part of the reason why we do, evangelism with all these modules where we teach people, approaches and stuff like that. I know some people are really opposed to that. I think it's good psychomotor learning. You teach them an approach to doing it and then let them develop beyond that. I think that's good psychomotor learning.
Do it.
But that's a different way of learning that you're teaching to. Some people say you're teaching to the hands instead of the head, and that's not exactly right, but it's close.
Yeah.
And then there is this affective domain of learning, this domain of learning where we're teaching towards the valuing of things, the heart of things, the compassion of things, that we're teaching people not just to know that God is holy, but to be in awe of the fact that God is holy, that we're teaching them not just to know that God is sovereign, but to love the sovereignty of God, that we're teaching people to appreciate those things, to value those things, and that's a different kind of learning than just learning the propositions, just understanding the propositions. So I guess to some extent, what we're talking about is leaning into, at least from a learning theory perspective, of leaning into this affective domain of learning, that we're not just learning the concepts, but we're learning to appreciate, to love, to hate, to respond to those things with a visceral heart kind of response. Whether that be, those things that we hate, Proverbs says, to love God is to hate evil. I hate arrogant pride, evil conduct, and perverse speech. Well, I'm supposed to have not just a cognitive understanding of that. I'm supposed to have a visceral understanding of that, a visceral reaction to that I hate those things, especially when I find them in myself, know, and, that when we see, Jesus kneeling over in prayer at the Garden of Gethsemane, and the Bible tells us that he's sweating and that his sweat is falling like drops of blood. That's not just to tell us, oh, well, what was happening was, the capillaries may have burst and it seemed like blood, and and it was, it was Jesus wrestling with yada yada yada. It's like we're supposed to hurt with him. We're supposed to feel the anguish that Jesus felt. And that's why the gospel writers why God inspires the gospel writers to use this rich language, is so that I don't just understand, I feel what he's feeling. I'm in anguish with him. I think that's maybe what we're talking about.
Well, and how do you make that step? I think that's probably we got to figure out is how do you make that step from reading the text well and understanding where these pieces come in, and then how do you get it to the people you're teaching?
I've got an interesting model, and you could step into virtually anything. Being a chef, martial arts. There are many things we could use here. Ultimately I'll use the example of my son, who's a mechanic. But you start off with a base of knowledge, right? I know what spices are. I know the difference between the noodles. I know different meats and stuff like that. Well, that's a good base of knowledge, and you got to have that. But then you go to the level of learning how those mix together, that's where you get to the stage, the psychomotor stage. It's where your hands and your head are working together to synthesize and create something. With my son, he seems intuitively to know everything there is to know about any kind of engine, right? Man, I look at it, I go, an engine. He looks at it and he can tell you all the different parts and stuff like that. But that's not what makes him a mechanic, right? He's a mechanic because he can take those parts and he knows what those parts do, how they fit in so that the engine will work when he puts it back together. Right. And then this is the big thing. He walked out going, Dad, I believe I can fix anything. That's that affective domain. I can do the way he feels, the way he understands it. I can do anything. And look, at seminary, our primary thing is we've got to teach that knowledge base. Because most of our students come here, they're in their mid-30s, and they've come out of every walk of life, and what they know is what they've learned in church. Well, there's massive amounts of information that they're going to be exposed to. And we've got to give them a base of knowledge so they can do it, because they cannot get to that next psychomotor step. What we're calling the competency level of having competency with all this stuff that they've learned. They've got to be able to put it into action. And then they have the confidence to believe, to feel, to love, all this stuff, and to direct that toward the people they're going to minister to. That makes sense. Is that model what you were saying?
You can't in class prepare for every situation you're going to come across in ministry. And anyone decades in ministry is still going to come across things and think, I've never even, how could I have prepared for this, basically? So it can't just be purely cognitive. You have to be able to teach people skills. And I guess I don't know if maybe emotional intelligence is a little bit too small of a word, but somehow getting to that affect level of how can I approach this unbelievable situation right now? I've got to be able to do this and do it in a biblical way.
And look, there's a mixing thing that takes place here, I think. I think once you've got the emotion, the thing that can drive you when you encounter something you don't know, or when you need to move and learn, get this knowledge base, it's that love, it's that passion that drives you to go back and start working.
See, and I think that's so important, because it's like, we assume that if people know the right things to do, they'll do the right things. I'm not sure that's really true. You know, the Bible seems to say that we can know the right things and still choose to do the wrong things. That there seems to be something about the affect, the values, the compassion, the ethos of what God says to us, what God's word. That it's when I am passionate and I love God that it changes my actions, that it changes the way that I live, that it changes the way that I respond to him. Certainly all that's fed by my understanding of who God is, but it's changing my heart that causes me to actually want to follow through and do those things that God's called me to do.
Can I kind of change directions here? We've been talking about Isaiah 6, this emotive language that really points there. If we go back to Genesis 22, this is the story where God tells Abraham, go take your son up and sacrifice him, which is odd. I mean, it's just an odd thing in a book, in a Bible that absolutely forbids human sacrifice. Right. It's an odd duck thing. But when you put it in the context of Abraham's call in Genesis 12, I'm going to make you a great nation, father of many nations, you're going to give you a land, in that call, and then in chapter 15 he reiterates the promise with this covenant, this crazy little thing with the pot flying around and stuff like that. Changes his name in chapter 17 and tells him again, you know, your descendants are going to be like the stars of the sky, the sands of the sea, and so forth. And then we get to chapter 22, and God said, Abraham, and he said, I'm here. He said, take your son. And I want you to notice, he reiterates Isaac in a little bit different way 4 times. Take your son, your only son, whom you have loved, Isaac. And then he tells him, and go and offer him up as a whole burnt offering. That means burn the whole thing, no bones, teeth, or anything. It burns, everything goes to me, everything's to me. And offer him as a whole burnt offering on one of the mountains I'll show you there. And we don't see, as we read the rest of the story, we don't see one emotional response from Abraham to any of this. So,
that's wild, isn't it? I mean, it's almost unbelievable that you would see that and then not have any emotional language in the story at all.
So our commitment to interpreting this really has to be, so why is this? It was clearly this test is the final test. And I'll just kind of back up and kind of give you Dr. Watson's answer on this. Is that this is the final thing. This is the final step. Not that God needed to prove to God that Abraham was capable. This is a test. It says, and God tested Abraham. This is a test of Abraham to demonstrate to Abraham, right? And so, you know, that's what this, and that's how we need to kind of look at where this passage is going. We get to the end, and God sees that he's faithful and stops him mid-stab with the knife and says, don't harm the boy, all right? Yeah. But I want, you know, you can stop and kind of step off to the side and turn back and look. And as a father of 3, I can look at this, and I can't imagine what it was like for God to tell Abram, take this son of promise that you've waited 99 years for, that your wife just got so tickled she couldn't hold in her laughter when God said, you know, you're going to have a baby. Yeah. And the danger that it represents, and God saying, go kill him. Right. And he does it. Can you imagine the pain, the struggle, the tears,
the turmoil?
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
And so even though we shouldn't let that have a major bearing on how we interpret, boy, it comes right out of our experience to look at it and say, man, you know, it helps us understand the level of commitment, the faith that God considered righteousness. It helps us measure what that means. Abraham believed God, and he credited him as righteousness.
When we look for that emotional response, it changes the level of faith, not the truth, but the Yeah, that's so good.
Yeah, it colors it in a very specific way. It really, and I think like that's the interesting thing that passage, if you take the time to understand that part, it can really, I think, to a lot of different people, bring that emotional level of understanding. I mean, certainly anyone who's had children or who's gone through a similar thing, maybe not to the extent of Abraham, you know, but that idea of like, I want children, we haven't been able to have children, and now I have to give that up. that's going to connect on a really different level. And the truth of Scripture, it's almost like the emotional part is just going to help that the truth of Scripture actually land and make sense to to a reader or I guess a listener in a session.
And when you come at it from another direction, you see the lengths to which God, how long-suffering God is with this. It's not just Abraham. We see that God is a God who understands the limitations that Abraham has. He understands the limitation as Abraham sees them. He's long-suffering, but he's also got a long-term plan. He's looking forward. We know that unless Isaac survives, at some point on this side of the cross, we know there's likely not going to be a Jesus, right? At least the way the story is told here. Yeah. It doesn't matter whether that could change or not. This is the story. This is where we're at. Mm-hmm. And if Isaac, it has an impact on the story as we know it. If Isaac dies here, and if he doesn't end up having a Jacob.
Yeah. All right. As we get close to wrapping up here, I think this is a particularly interesting case with our question for the spinny board, because what we do with this, when we spin it, we're looking at different age groups, and our age groups are going to have very different levels of emotional maturity, understanding, experience. So I think I kind of want to keep the question a bit broad. It's like, it kind of goes back to like that initial topic we kind of opened with of the idea, like, how do you teach for the heart? But how are you going to do that? Like, what passages you're going to use? How are you going to approach it? Maybe even like what kind of language you're going to use, depending on this age group. But we're going to land on when we spin here.
I'm already deferring to you.
Well, this is a good one.
That's a good one.
Seniors. So this is going to be people who've had a lot of emotional experience, right. That's interesting. I think that's an interesting setting for this kind of question.
They're on the end of their lives. Most of them are very frank about it. We're starting, especially now, we're starting to see spouses losing spouses.
Sure.
Watching my mom, my mother-in-law, both of them in the last year or so, both lost their husbands. It's interesting to watch the difference in the way each deals with it, but the emptiness, the thing they share in common is that dad or father-in-law shaped hole that's left in their lives after 60, 70 years.
Right.
And, the questions that they're asking about God, the things that they need to know about God, the things that they need to experience from God, are steeped in that kind of emotion. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does God really love me? How can he leave me in this circumstance?
Right.
Well, and I think there have been so many situations over the years where I've been with senior adults as they started to look towards death, and I mean, when we're talking about senior adulthood, it's kind of a broad topic, right? Because there are at least 3 levels of senior adults, and maybe more than that. That there are those who are sort of wrapping up their careers, and then there are those who are sort of investing in the whatever travel or family or whatever they've wanted to do, that they haven't had a chance to. And then there are those who are starting to decline and starting to need more help and not able to do that. So, so certainly senior adults are not like one package, but I think that as you sit next to people who've walked with Jesus for their whole life, it's like the emotion becomes very real to them, whether it's, I'm looking forward to the day when I close my eyes and I get to wake up in the presence of Jesus instead. Yeah. That's not a conceptual thing for them. It's an emotional thing for them. Right. It's based in truth, absolutely, but it's not, it's not like that's what it's about. It's the emotion of when I get to open my eyes the next morning and I'm in the presence of Christ, that means something. And I think as we help them to sort of walk through the walk through the text, whatever text we're using. If you're talking about Abraham and talking about him being an old man and just having his first son, and however old Isaac was, and he's asked to give him up, talk to me about the emotion that you think he would feel. Or if we're talking about a text like, Isaiah of standing in the presence of God, what emotion does that bring out for you as you think about standing in the presence of God? I think that helping them to recap and recall. I mean, one of the things that senior adults start to do anyway, as they get farther into their lives, they're wrapping up their lives, as they start doing this remembering, recapitulating, kind of working back through their life as a way of reminiscing. I think it's called in literature, as a way of sort of putting the pieces of their life together in a way that makes sense to them, and to give them opportunities to use the text to start to re-experience some of the things that they've dealt with. Seems like to me that it would be really helpful, both in terms of their understanding of the text and in terms of their spiritual process, their spiritual processing.
And think about the courage these people. I mean, my dad had a dementia for 10 years, and my mom was his primarily caretaker. They start losing the ability to walk and move. Right. They start having disease and stuff sets in. And for the most part, they're gracious, they're friendly, they smile. The pain that you see them with, the arthritis and things that they go through, the desire, this underlying heartbeat desire to go see their, see the dead spouse again.
Right.
The absolute courage that they display. And a lot of the people in my Sunday school class that are in this time of life and are watching their spouses, the dependence that they have on God, the joy that they find. Suddenly, I think a lot of them understand what sovereignty, what transcendence really, really means. It means this God doesn't feel like this.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think I think this is true. I don't think that as we grow, we stop having simple emotions, but we do have more complicated situations that we're in, and we have a lot of different responses. I mean, just like you were saying, you're caring for a person maybe for a decade, and then they're gone. So it's a really, really dense situation. But of course, like we've kind of been saying throughout this whole podcast, is like you always can come back to the truth in the Bible, and there's an answer to that.
Right.
It's not divorced from emotion, but it is over emotion.
And why deny the people in our classrooms, in our congregations? Why deny them that emotional handle?
Yeah. And it's a strong part of your experience in your life, and that's why people think that it's true, right? Because I mean, it can be an overwhelming feeling. It can color every single part of your life, but to be able to go back and rely on truth to help understand that and process your own emotion and still have that be subservient in a way to God, like that's a good thing to go through.
Yeah.
It's interesting, I think, as I'm assessing just where we are in this podcast emotionally, that was kind of heavy towards the end,
Well, you can, if you hear, watching my mom and my mother-in-law go through this season has been tough.
That's right. Yeah. And we can't avoid that. And we may have misnamed our podcast, because I feel like almost every time we get to the end, the answer that I'm going to try to encourage people to do is to read it slow. Yeah. And then maybe that's really, we should call this thing is the Read It Slow podcast.
The whole podcast is written slow. That's good.
But it's true. I think you need to do that. You got to take a little bit more time going through the text and ask that question of like, what's happening here, and how is this going to, what emotion is this supposed to draw out as I'm teaching this lesson, this week in my Bible school class or preaching, whatever that teaching context is. Take that time to really investigate and wrestle with the text on that level, as well as the cognitive level. I think that's a good way to go forward.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much, guys.